What Nails It by Greil Marcus. Greil Gerstly. I write for fun. I write for play. I write for the play of words. I write to discover what I want to say and how to say it, and the nerve to say it. The key word for me here is not fun, play, but discover. I live for those moments when something appears on the page as if of its own volition, as if I had nothing to do with what is now looking me in the face. In 1965, Bob Dylan described his song Like a Rolling Stone as 20 pages of vomit. Boiled down to a point of hatred, well, he said later, maybe 10 pages. But much later, almost 50 years later, he described it very differently. It's like a ghost is writing a song like that, he said, talking to Robert Hilburn of the Los Angeles Times. It gives you the song and then it goes away. It goes away. You don't know what it means, except the ghost picked me to write the song. That's a very evocative, very romantic account of what anyone who engages in any sort of creativity. That's a very evocative, very romantic account of what anyone who engages in any sort of creative activity experiences at any time. For a lot of people, that sense of an evanescent gift, the genie granting you a wish even if you never asked for it, that sense of visitation, is what it's all for, a moment of inexplicable clarity. Quote, when you put the music with words and things together, the songs just make themselves, end of quote. The 1950s New Orleans rock and roll pianist and singer Huey Piano Smith once said. He wrote Frankie Ford's Sea Cruise. He wrote Don't You Just Know It? But he's best remembered for The Rockin' Pneumonia and the Boogie Woogie Flu. A follow-up to Berkeley-Lucas and the Sinus Blues was not so hot. But he went on. Quote, after you listen on it, end of quote, he said of putting things together, quote, it says something of its own self that you hadn't planned, end of quote. Talking about stand-up comedy, Richard Belzer said the same thing, quote, the greatest thing for me is when I make the audience laugh in a moment that could only happen that night with that audience, end of quote. When Bob Dylan recorded Like a Rolling Stone live in the studio with a 6-piece band over 2 days and 24 takes, 24 stabs, false starts, breakdowns. Only twice did they make it all the way through the 4-verse, 6-minute song. And the second time was all trip, stumble, and fall. That's what Richard Belzer was talking about, that single moment when what you're writing, painting, singing, telling, speaks in its own voice, which is and isn't yours. Quote, sometimes I laugh with the audience because I'm hearing the joke the same time they are. The feeling of, no, I didn't think that, I didn't write that. Where did that come from? And I mean that literally, absolutely having no memory of creating, composing, fashioning what is there staring at you, saying, all right, here it is. What are you going to make of this? I remember the first time it happened. It was 1973. I had dropped out of graduate school at Berkeley after finishing my coursework and barely passing my orals. I sat for 3 hours outside the room where I'd met with 3 professors, going through every stage of grief, denial, disbelief, fury, and finally, not caring. Then I was offered the chance to teach the American Studies Honors Seminar, a 2-semester, year-long course for sophomores, with 1 teacher each from history, English, and my department, political science. I was preening over the prestige. No graduate student had ever taught it. I had taken it over 1964 and 1965 with Michael Rogan from political science and Lars Ziff from English. It was a revelation. It introduced me to the terrain and the conversation that for good or ill would lie behind what I would end up doing for the rest of my life. It was that classroom engagement when an atmosphere is conjured up where anything can be said and anything can be understood, where any idea or any argument opens up instantly and naturally into another, until finally the whole class finds itself at the top of a pyramid, dizzy with the notion that now, with the day's class over, you have to find a way down, which is a version of that out-of-nowhere sentence showing up on a page and asking you if you can take the next step or fail it. Fail the dare it's throwing at you. Abandon it as if it was never there at all. That's a translation of how the class actually worked. In the evening, a number of us would gather in the seminar room, which was on an upper floor of the great main library. That's a translation of how the class actually worked. In the evening, a number of us would gather in the seminar room, which was on an upper floor of the great main library, and which was also a library in itself. The books the class was made of: Perry Miller's biography of Jonathan Edwards, a battered but intact original edition of John Adams' Discourses on Davila. We'd stay reading and talking long after the library was locked up for the night, and at 1 or 2 in the morning climb out of the window on a rope, one by one. It fell to the last person out to show up the next morning when the library opened and pull up the rope. Through most of graduate school, I'd been writing for Rolling Stone, then Cream. Starting in 1968, I'd been sending in record reviews to Rolling Stone. They were printing them. It was a professional operation, at least compared to the so-called underground newspapers of the time. I was shocked after the first review ran to find a check for $12.50 in the mail a week later. A few months after that, I met someone who worked for the paper, that's what it was called then, a fold-over newsprint tabloid, and started complaining about the record review section. It was all writing about lyrics. Nobody was writing about music. Nobody was writing about how anything felt, how anything moved, how anything moved you. A few days later, I got a call from the editor, Jan Winter, who I'd met when we were both freshmen at Cal, though this was 5 years later and we hadn't seen each other since. "This is Jan," he said, as if we'd been talking that day before and he was just picking up the conversation where it had left off. "If you think the record section is so terrible, why don't you edit it?" So I did for 6 months, until after the murderous Rolling Stone show at Altamont at the tail end of 1969, the most violent day of my life, when I was burned out. I recruited the late Ed Ward to replace me, and I kept writing until I was fired 6 months later. I went on to the much scruffier and much more try-anything Cream magazine from Detroit. Rolling Stone in 1968 and 1969 was very try-anything because there were no rules, except that we were making our own. And Cream wasn't making any rules at all. Then in 1972, I left graduate school. I'd always assumed I'd become a professor. I had such great professors at Berkeley, along with Michael Rogan and Lars Rzif, Jean Char and Norman Jacobson. They were inspiring figures. They were devoted to students. They looked you in the eye. They let you know that they believed you had something to contribute in a class, in a paper, even to the field, the discipline, the discourse, the conversation that had been going on for centuries, and you felt called to try to live up to that. But as a teacher myself, I wasn't. I had no patience. And a teacher without patience is not a teacher. Instead of, quote, "tell us what you mean," end of quote, when a student said something that seemed wrong, I heard, quote, "how could you say that?" end of quote, coming out of my mouth. When I thought everyone was missing the point, I'd pontificate for 5 minutes and shut everyone up for the rest of the class. When I taught again after nearly 30 years of never stepping inside a classroom, I was ready to learn that if there was a point that absolutely needed to be made, an idea that simply had to be addressed, even a fact that needed to be stated, if I could keep quiet for 5 minutes, someone in the class would find their way there. I found out that the ideal class would be one in which I didn't say a word. Once at Princeton, it actually happened. But at Berkeley, I came home from every class angry and in despair. I had wonderful students, 3 of whom are close friends to this day, but I was cheating them out of their own education. I'd had enough bad teachers not to want to become one. I realized I couldn't spend the rest of my life doing something I didn't like and wasn't good at. At that point, the other thing I knew how to do was write. So now, after 4 years as a journalist, I was trying to write a book. It was a book that came straight out of that 1964-65 American Studies seminar when I was 19. Michael Rogan was 27 and Larzer Ziff was 37. Out of that, and out of living my life to the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, rediscovering Little Richard and Elvis Presley, discovering Robert Johnson, now for what would in 1975 be called Mystery Train, Images of America in Rock and Roll Music, I was writing about Sly and the Family Stone. Within the frame of the black folklore figure Stagger Lee, the bad man, the man of impulse and appetite, a walking advertisement for freedom and revenge, style and death, living life without limits, someone who'd kill someone else over a hat, a real person as it turned out, one, quote, stag, end of quote, Lee Shelton, who in 1895 in St. Louis shot Billy Lyons in an argument over a Stetson hat in Bill Curtis's saloon. Now it's an office building. Years later, I was taken there. I took twigs from a bush in the landscaping. Right off, maybe the next night, someone composed the street ballad, quote, Staggo Lee and Billy, end of quote. Within days, it was traveling up and down the Mississippi. Within a decade or two, with the real facts behind the song forgotten or never known, never mattering. Who cared where a song came from when the story it told was so good everyone wanted to claim it? People would tell you they remembered Stagger Lee, heard about him, knew someone who knew him. In Chicago, Memphis, New Orleans, even New York. Lloyd Price, from Kenner, Louisiana, now home of the Louis Armstrong International Airport, remembered growing up and watching local pimps and gangsters with their colored zoot suits and Cadillacs. To young boys like him, they were all Stagger Lees. Stationed in Korea, he staged a play based on the old ballad when he took his version of the song to the top of the charts in 1958. Stagger Lee was stomping through every town in the country. The whole nation sang the song. Lee Shelton would have heard it himself in dozens of versions over the next decade after Billy Lyons was buried, and into the decade after that, in and out of prison until he died there in 1912. But as a song, it was also a legend, a myth that from its start traveled through the next century and beyond. As music, in novels and movies by 2008, even a porn film starring Sasha Grey and directed by one Benny Profane. But all that history was written later. With no facts at hand, even after months of searching, it was the myth I was writing about. I was trying to imagine who Stagger Lee would be, how he would act, how the world would open up before him or close around him. He was a hero. He played out his string, then it snapped back around his neck. I started with a declarative sentence. After that, some uncanny cadence took over the words. As if in a trance, the words were making their own rhythm. Quote, Stagger Lee is a free man because he takes chances and scoffs at the consequences. Others gather to fawn over him until he shatters in a grimy celebration of needles, juice, and noise. Finally, he is alone in a slow bacchanal, where his buddies, in a parody of friendship, devote themselves to a study of the precise moment of betrayal. What came down, I think, what appeared, were those words, quote, slow bacchanal, end of quote. That was the prize. That was the treasure. I just had to figure out what to do with it. Find out what it wanted, what images it was making, what the story was that was hidden in the two words.